Welcome to Slayer the Alchemist, where we discuss all things heavy metal and hard rock. On today's episode, big albums with bad drum sounds. These are albums from bigger bands with bigger budgets where the drums do not sound very good on them. Maybe they're just distracting. Maybe they're just awful. Drums are one of the harder things to mix on an album. You've got a lot of elements going on, and getting a good drum sound can be really tricky. So when the drum sound isn't good, it can sometimes be very distracting. And I didn't want to pick small bands with no budgets, because usually when a band doesn't have any kind of budget, the one thing that usually suffers first is the drums. So I didn't want to pick on small bands that have no budget, that weren't on big labels and things like that. I thought I would go for albums where the drums should have sounded better on them. Okay, I've got 5 records here. Some of them also suffer from using a drum machine, and we'll get to that. There's a couple in here that have drum machines on them. For those who don't know, a drum machine is basically you program the drums on a computer, or before computers, there were just machines that you could program the drums into and use them this way. But my first selection here out of my 5, it's not a drum machine, and it's probably the lowest budget one on this list here. So I felt a little bad putting it on here, but I really felt like I needed to do it. But Leprosy, the snare drum sound on this album is just, I can't handle it. It's so loud in the mix. It's very, like, there's an effect or something on it. It's gated, or I'm not exactly sure what you would call it. And it's a shame, because this is a really good album. It's a monumental death metal album, but I cannot get past the snare drum sound on this record. It is so distracting. And because it's death metal, there's a lot of fast beats where the snare drum is hitting like on every beat. And because of the way the snare drum sounds, it's so loud. It's so, like, whatever the effect is that's on it is just so distracting that unfortunately I cannot listen to this album. It unfortunately, it ruins the album for me, which is sad because it's a great album. Okay, number 2 for me. Now this one is, from what I've read, they used a drum machine on this album, and the drummer only came in and played some cymbals on it, and that's Def Leppard's Pyromania. And this is one of those things that when I was younger, it didn't really bother me, but as I've gotten older, and once you notice it, once you start really listening to the drums and you hear how robotic they sound, and especially the snare drum, you're going to hear this a lot. The snare drum is, like, because it's the most prominent sound on the drum kit, it's the one that if it doesn't sound right, it's really going to jump out at you, because the drummer's constantly hitting it. It jumps out in the mix the most. And this is the case here. It just sounds so robotic, electronic sounding. I don't even know if maybe, again, I read the engineer or something that said that, yeah, it was a drum machine. But they did every now and then play some real cymbals or something like that. But the kick and the snare are a drum machine. And it's hard for me to listen to this album now and not hear that kick, and especially the snare drum. It's distracting to me, which is a shame, because this is another great album. Okay, number 3. This one is definitely a drum machine. ZZ Top, Afterburner. Why on earth? I mean, I guess it's hard to argue, because these albums were such big hits for them during this era of the band. But man, ZZ Top in the 70s is so awesome. They've got this great organic live sound to their playing in the 70s. And then in the 80s, when they started using drum machines and synthesizers and stuff, man, for me, it just sucked all the life out of the band. And on this album, it is just, the drum machine just sounds so stiff. It sounds awful. And here's the other problem. Back then, drum machines didn't sound that great. Nowadays, they're with computers and everything, you can have it sound like a real drum. It's almost impossible to tell that it's not a real drummer at times. But back then, that technology didn't exist. And when I try to listen to this album, I mean, I listened to it briefly, just a few songs to refresh my memory, and things like Sleeping Bag and stuff. Gosh, man, the drums are so clunky and robotic sounding that it's just awful. I can't listen to this album. Okay, where am I? Number four. Number four for me, and I could have also gone with Turbo because I'm pretty sure that's a drum machine on Turbo. And the same thing with Ram It Down. I don't know if quite the entire record is a drum machine, but a lot of it is. And I went with Ram It Down because I don't have Turbo on vinyl, and I actually think the drums sound worse on Ram It Down. They just sound dated, distracting. The snare drum sound is terrible. I don't particularly like this album in general or the sound of this album in general. And the drums just add to it. They're just not even programmed very creatively. So they're very dated. You listen to it now and again, it dates itself. It just does not sound that good. All right, at number one, I don't have this one. I don't have a copy of this one. Maybe you could have guessed which one this is going to be. This is the big one here for terrible drum sounds, and it's Metallica's Saint Anger. And it's really the snare drum sound on this record. Lars's snare drum sound, I have no idea what he was thinking. It sounds like, for those who don't know, a snare drum there's a head on the top, which they hit, and underneath it there's springs that when you tighten the springs, that's what gives the snare drum its crack, its bright sound. When you loosen the snares underneath the drum, you get this what they call like a timbali sound. This very it sounds almost like a tom. It has no brightness or crack to it. And that's what it sounds like he did on this album. Like he just turned his snare off. That's what people say when you loosen the springs on the bottom. It's like he turned his snare off. So when he was hitting it, it doesn't even sound like a snare. And man, when it's just like kind of in a slower type of setting, but when he's playing like fast like that, and that snare drum is just it is like so distracting. Like most Metallica albums, the drums are too loud in the mix, and that snare drum, it just absolutely ruins that record. I've actually tried to get into that record because I know it's a very unpopular record, and I thought, well, maybe there's something here, but I can't listen to it. I can't, especially if I'm wearing headphones. The snare drum is just, you can't get past it. It's like just so distracting in the mix. All right, so there you go. 5 big albums with decent budgets that have a bad drum sound on them. Let me know down below what you think of my picks. Let me know some of your picks down below. Again, let's keep it to bands that should have known better, that should have been able to get a better drum sound. Let me know down below. And you know what? And this is one of those weird things that once you hear it, like that Def Leppard Pyromania, once you start to hear it, it's like you can't unhear it. Every time you listen to it, you're just consumed by that sound. So let me know down below what you think of my picks. Some bigger bands, bigger budgets with bad drum sounds. Let me know down below. Till we see you again, make sure you stay heavy, stay metal.